The service corridor of Centauri Prime's main spaceport was mercifully empty at this early hour. Caldra ducked her head as she passed through another doorway designed for beings nearly 3 feet shorter than her 8-foot frame. It was a familiar motion, one her body performed automatically after years of painful lessons. Her maintenance uniform, specially made at triple the normal cost, hung loosely from her broad shoulders. The Centauri Spaceport Authority had complained about the expense, just as they complained about everything concerning her employment. But skilled technicians were rare, and Caldra's hands, though oversized by Centauri standards, possessed remarkable dexterity with machinery. Maintenance access requested in Docking Bay 7, chirped her communication device. Final preparations for human delegation arrival. Caldra sighed, her violet eyes closing briefly. The humans. Everyone on Centauri Prime had been talking about nothing else for weeks. The first official delegation from Earth, a historic moment for interspecies relations. And somehow, she'd been assigned to oversee environmental systems in their quarters. Acknowledged, she replied, her deep voice resonating in the empty corridor. As she approached the docking bay, voices drifted from around the corner. Caldra slowed her pace, her four-fingered hand tightening around her tool case. Did you hear? They assigned the freak to the human quarters, came a sneering voice she recognized as belonging to Telner, one of the port administrators. Perhaps appropriate, replied another. I've heard these humans are all oversized and ungainly. They'll feel at home with her. Laughter followed, the familiar, cutting kind that had been the soundtrack to Caldra's 32 years of life. She waited until the voices faded before continuing her journey. The words shouldn't still hurt after all this time, but they did, each barb finding its way through armor built from years of isolation. Among the Centauri, whose average height was 5 feet, Caldra was a biological anomaly. A genetic mutation had caused her unprecedented growth, making her nearly twice the size of her peers. Her parents, respected geneticists, had been so embarrassed by her condition that they'd surrendered her to a state institution at age 6. Their research failed to correct her, so they removed her from their lives entirely. The institution had been little better than a prison. Other children had tormented her relentlessly, their natural Centauri xenophobia turned against one of their own. Teachers had treated her as a scientific curiosity rather than a child in need of nurturing. Caldra had grown in height but learned to make herself small in every other way. The spaceport job had been a rare stroke of fortune. Working night shifts, handling the complex environmental systems that kept the facility functioning, she could minimize contact with others. The machines didn't call her tower freak or genetic mistake. They simply responded to her skilled touch, their inner workings a language she understood far better than social interaction. Arriving at Docking Bay 7, Caldra surveyed the environmental control panel. Everything needed to be recalibrated for human comfort, slightly higher oxygen levels, warmer temperatures, different humidity. Her fingers moved rapidly across the interface, making precise adjustments based on the specifications provided. Is it true they breathe nitrogen compounds that would be toxic to us? Asked a timid voice. Caldra turned to find Prill, a young maintenance worker recently assigned to her team. Unlike most Centauri, Prill seemed more curious about Caldra's knowledge than disturbed by her appearance. No, Caldra replied, her voice softening slightly. They breathe the same oxygen we do, just in different concentrations. Their atmospheric composition contains more nitrogen, but it's not toxic in itself. Prill nodded, watching Caldra's hands move across the controls with undisguised admiration. You know so much about them. I read the briefing materials, Caldra said, though she didn't mention the additional research she'd conducted in her sparse free time. Something about these humans had captured her interest, perhaps because they were described as wildly variable in appearance, with heights ranging from under 5 feet to over 7 feet. An announcement echoed through the spaceport, "Attention all personnel. Earth vessel, Horizon approaching final docking procedures." All non-essential staff clear docking bay 7. Prill scurried away, but Caldra remained, needing to monitor the environmental systems during the docking process. As the massive bay doors slid open to admit the sleek human vessel, she pressed herself against the wall, trying as always to occupy less space than her body required. What she didn't expect was the strange flutter of anticipation in her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. These humans who came in all shapes and sizes, would they look at her differently than her own people did? The ship's landing ramp extended, and Caldra held her breath. Caldra's pulse quickened as the first of the humans descended the ramp. The delegation moved with practiced diplomacy, their faces composed in expressions of polite interest as they surveyed the docking bay. 5 humans in total, 3 males and 2 females, dressed in formal attire that seemed to shimmer under the spaceport's harsh lighting. But it was the last member of the group who caused Caldra's breath to catch in her throat. He stood taller than the others, his broad-shouldered frame easily reaching 6 feet 4 inches. His skin was a rich brown, his head crowned with close-cropped dark hair, and when he smiled at something one of his companions said, Caldra noticed the warmth that transformed his entire face. The Zentari Welcoming Committee, a collection of high-ranking officials who had made Caldra's life miserable on numerous occasions, approached with formal greetings. She remained in her corner, monitoring the environmental controls and hoping to remain unnoticed as always. Her hopes were dashed when Port Administrator Vellner gestured in her direction. And this is our specialized maintenance technician, Caldra. She will be overseeing the environmental systems in your quarters. The tall human's eyes found her immediately, and instead of the familiar revulsion or morbid curiosity she was accustomed to, his expression registered something entirely different: appreciation. Nathan Reed, he introduced himself, breaking from the group and approaching her with an extended hand. Lead Cultural Liaison. I understand we have you to thank for making sure we can breathe comfortably. Caldra stared at his outstretched hand, momentarily forgetting the human custom she had read about. Awkwardly, she extended her own 4-fingered hand, engulfing his in her larger grasp. Yes, she managed, her voice uncharacteristically uncertain. I've calibrated the environmental controls to Earth-standard atmosphere. Nathan's grip was firm, his hand warm against her cooler skin. Perfect. And I understand you'll be our point person for any adjustments needed? Before she could respond, Vellner inserted himself between them. Caldra will handle technical matters only. For any other needs, the delegation will have proper liaison officers. Nathan's eyebrows rose slightly, but his diplomatic training held. Of course. Though I've always found that technical staff know the best secrets of any facility. He winked at Caldra, the gesture so unexpected that she nearly dropped her diagnostic tablet. The official tour commenced, with Caldra trailing behind, a shadow at the edge of the proceedings. She noticed how Nathan ducked slightly when passing through standard Zentari doorways, nothing like her own awkward stooping, but enough to create a strange sense of kinship. Later that day, as she finalized the atmospheric calibrations in the human quarters, Caldra found herself alone with Nathan. He entered the common area while she was adjusting the lighting spectrum to more closely match Earth's sun. There you are, he said, as if he'd been looking for her specifically. I wanted to thank you properly, without the entire diplomatic corps hovering. Caldra straightened from the control panel, automatically ducking her head despite the higher ceilings in these visitor quarters. You don't need to thank me, she replied. It's my assigned function. Nathan studied her with undisguised interest. You know, on Earth, you'd be considered tall, but not extraordinarily so. We have professional athletes who reach your height. The statement was so casual, yet it struck Caldra like a physical blow. On Earth, she wouldn't be a freak? Your species has such variation, she asked, unable to mask her curiosity. Absolutely. Humans range from under 4 feet to over 8 feet tall. Different builds, different colors, different features, diversity is our hallmark. He smiled, moving closer. I must admit, I was surprised to see someone of your stature here. The briefings mentioned Zentari typically standing around 5 feet. I am abnormal, Caldra said, the words automatic after years of hearing them from others. Nathan's face clouded. I wouldn't use that word. Unique, perhaps. Distinctive. Certainly impressive. The compliment, if that's what it was, left Caldra speechless. No one had ever described her presence as impressive before. The others of your kind, Nathan continued, gesturing vaguely toward the spaceport beyond, they seem uncomfortable around you. Why is that? Caldra's hands tightened on her toolkit. Zentari value uniformity. Genetic anomalies are considered unfortunate failures. Their loss, Nathan said simply. On Earth, you'd have people looking up to you, literally and figuratively. A small sound escaped Caldra, something between a laugh and a gasp, before she could suppress it. The idea was so foreign that it bordered on absurd. I've embarrassed you, Nathan said, his tone apologetic. Cultural misstep. One of many I'll probably make during this mission. No, Caldra replied quickly. I'm simply unaccustomed to conversation. Then I hope you'll indulge me in more of it during my stay. I find I have questions about Zentari Prime that weren't covered in our briefings. His smile returned, warm and genuine. And I suspect you might have answers that others wouldn't think to share. A chime from the communication system interrupted them, the rest of the human delegation requesting Nathan's presence for the evening's formal reception. Duty calls, he sighed. Will you be at the reception tonight? Caldra shook her head firmly. I am not invited to diplomatic functions. The very thought made her insides clench with anxiety. Pity, Nathan said, and he sounded like he actually meant it. Well, I hope our paths cross again soon, Caldra. As he left, Caldra remained rooted to the spot, trying to process what had just happened. A human, an important human diplomat, no less, had spoken to her as if she were a person of value. Had looked at her height with admiration instead of disgust. For the first time in her adult life, Caldra felt something dangerous begin to stir within her chest, the faintest glimmer of hope. 3 weeks into the human delegation's visit, Caldra found herself experiencing something entirely new, anticipation for the day ahead. What had begun as occasional encounters with Nathan had evolved into regular conversations. He sought her out during her maintenance rounds, bringing questions about Zentari culture that somehow always led to discussions about Earth. So humans actually celebrate physical differences? Caldra asked one afternoon as she recalibrated the water purification system in the human quarters. Nathan, perched on a nearby console, despite her warnings about sensitive equipment, nodded enthusiastically. Not universally, we're far from perfect. But generally, yes. We have competitions celebrating strength, height, speed. Models who are prized for being taller than average. Basketball players who make fortunes because they can reach higher than others. Basketball? The word felt strange on her tongue. Nathan's face lit up. I need to show you. He pulled out his data tablet, fingers swiping rapidly across the screen before turning it toward her. Here. Caldra watched, fascinated, as humans taller even than herself moved with grace and power across a court, leaping to place a ball through a raised hoop. They're celebrated for this? They're heroes, Nathan confirmed. Children dream of growing tall enough to play professionally. The concept was so alien to Caldra that she fell silent, trying to imagine a world where her height might be considered an advantage rather than a shameful defect. Would you consider attending a function with me? Nathan asked suddenly. The trade minister is hosting a dinner tomorrow, and I'd value having someone there who understands both the technical systems and the cultural nuances I might miss. Alarm flashed through Caldra. I am not welcome at such gatherings. You would be as my guest, Nathan insisted. Unless you're concerned about how your people would react? The question was gentle, but it struck at the heart of Caldra's decades of conditioning. She had spent her life hiding, minimizing her presence, accepting that she didn't belong in public spaces. "I would be conspicuous," she said finally. Nathan's gaze was steady. "Sometimes being conspicuous is its own kind of power, Caldra." The next evening found Caldra standing outside the trade minister's residence, her maintenance uniform replaced by formal attire that she'd fabricated herself years ago but never had occasion to wear. The fabric shimmered in deep blues that complemented her pale lavender skin, the cut emphasizing rather than hiding her height. Nathan waited at the entrance, his smile brilliant when he caught sight of her. "You came," he said, sounding genuinely delighted. "I may regret it," she replied, acutely aware of the stares from both Centauri and humans nearby. "Only one way to find out." He offered his arm in a formal human gesture. "Shall we?" Inside, the reaction to Caldra's presence was exactly as she had feared. Conversation stuttered to a halt as she entered. Centauri officials exchanged shocked glances. Several deliberately turned their backs. "Minister Thaldak," Nathan called, guiding Caldra directly toward their host. "May I introduce Caldra, who has been instrumental in ensuring our delegation's comfort during our stay." The minister's face twitched with poorly concealed dismay, but diplomatic protocol prevailed. "How unexpected to see you in this setting, technician." Caldra has been sharing fascinating insights about Centauri engineering principles, Nathan continued smoothly. "Did you know your atmospheric regulation systems have applications that could revolutionize habitat development on our Mars colony?" What followed was the most surreal evening of Caldra's life. Nathan kept her firmly at his side, introducing her to humans who showed genuine interest in her expertise and including her in discussions where Centauri officials could not easily ignore her. Most shocking was the revelation that the humans genuinely did not seem bothered by her size. If anything, several expressed admiration. "You remind me of my sister," said one human female diplomat. "She's 6'5" and captains a basketball team back on Earth. I'd love to see her expression if she met you. She's not used to looking up at anyone." The evening took an unexpected turn when a group of Centauri officials approached, among them, Rilner and Pelvin, who had been among Caldra's cruelest tormentors in her youth. "Fascinating specimen you've adopted, Diplomat Reed," Rilner said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Though I would caution against forming too strong an attachment. Genetic anomalies often come with shortened lifespans and mental instabilities." Caldra felt herself shrinking inward, old habits reasserting themselves in the face of familiar cruelty. But Nathan's response was immediate and firm. "On Earth, we consider diversity of form to be evolutionary strength, not weakness. In fact, Caldra's height and proportional strength would be highly valued qualities where I come from." Rilner's face darkened. "Perhaps humans are more primitive than we realized, if deformity is considered advantageous." The room had grown quieter, the confrontation drawing attention. "Or perhaps," Nathan replied, his voice carrying clearly, "we've simply learned that judging individuals by arbitrary physical standards limits the potential of a civilization. After all, different perspectives, even physical ones, lead to different solutions." He turned to Caldra, whose heart was pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. "Wouldn't you agree that seeing things from your height gives you insights others might miss?" For a moment, Caldra couldn't respond, years of conditioning fighting against the urge to claim her own value. Then, slowly, she straightened to her full height, no longer hunching to appear smaller. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than she'd ever allowed it to be in public. "I believe it does." The ripple of reaction through the Centauri officials was palpable, but so was the approving nods from the human delegation. And in Nathan's eyes, she saw something that made her heart beat even faster: pride. It was a small moment, perhaps insignificant in the grand scheme of interstellar relations. But for Caldra, standing tall among her people for the first time in her life, it felt like the beginning of a revolution. "You're avoiding me," Nathan said, appearing suddenly in the maintenance bay where Caldra had indeed been hiding for the past 3 days. After the Trade Ministry function, whispers had followed her throughout the spaceport, some odd, most disapproving. The Zentari Council had issued a formal reminder about appropriate interaction protocols with alien visitors. While not explicitly naming her, the timing made the target clear. "I'm completing scheduled maintenance," she replied, not meeting his eyes as she recalibrated a ventilation unit. "For 72 consecutive hours?" Nathan leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Even Zentari need rest, according to our cultural briefings." Caldra sighed, finally looking up. The sight of him still caused an uncomfortable flutter in her chest, a sensation she'd been trying and failing to suppress. "My presence at the function has created complications. For you or for the Zentari authorities?" Nathan asked shrewdly. "Both." She set down her tools. "Interspecies fraternization is discouraged." "Fraternization?" Nathan's eyebrow rose. "Is that what we're doing?" Heat rushed to Caldra's face, turning her lavender skin a deeper purple. "I didn't mean to imply. Because if we're being honest," he continued, moving closer, "I'd say we've moved well beyond fraternization into something more specific." Caldra's four-fingered hand tightened around her calibration tool. "Nathan, I'm not. This isn't." She struggled for words. "I'm not even considered normal among my own kind. The idea of anything between us is complicated," he supplied. "Unusual? Potentially diplomatically problematic?" "All true." His voice softened. "But that doesn't make it impossible, unless you don't feel what I feel." The directness of his statement left her speechless. Among Zentari, such emotional declarations would be considered vulgar, inappropriate. But Nathan wasn't Zentari, and the human approach to relationships was refreshingly straightforward. "I don't know what I feel," she admitted finally. "No one has ever wanted you?" Nathan completed gently. "Been attracted to you? Found your intelligence and resilience captivating?" Each word struck Caldra like a physical blow. "Yes," she whispered. "Well, I do." Nathan closed the distance between them, looking up slightly to meet her eyes. "And I'd like to explore what that means, if you're willing." Their first kiss happened there in the maintenance bay, surrounded by tools and environmental controls. Nathan had to stand on his toes, Caldra had to bend down, and neither of them cared about the awkwardness of it. His lips were warm against her cooler ones, the sensation entirely new and overwhelming. When they parted, Caldra felt as though something fundamental had shifted within her, as if her center of gravity had realigned. "That was..." she began. "Just the beginning," Nathan finished, his smile brighter than she'd ever seen it. The weeks that followed were a delicate balance of public-professional interaction and private exploration of their deepening connection. Nathan taught her about human customs of courtship, while Caldra revealed the few Zentari traditions of bonding that she knew only from observation. In the privacy of her modest quarters, larger than standard Zentari accommodations due to her size, they created their own rituals. Nathan shared music from Earth, playing recordings that filled the room with sounds unlike anything in Zentari culture. They exchanged stories of their childhoods, his filled with siblings and movement between human colonies, hers isolated but rich with self-taught knowledge. And there were moments of physical discovery, tentative at first, then growing in confidence. Caldra learned that her height and strength, so long sources of shame, could be sources of pleasure when she lifted Nathan effortlessly, when her larger hands covered more of his skin, when her longer arms enveloped him completely. "You're perfect," he whispered against her neck one night as they lay together on her custom-built sleeping platform. "Do you know that? Absolutely perfect as you are." Caldra had no words to respond, overcome by emotions she'd never expected to experience. Instead, she showed him with touches and kisses how his acceptance had transformed her. But their bubble of happiness couldn't remain isolated from reality. The human delegation's mission was scheduled for 3 months, 2 of which had already passed. And opposition to their relationship was growing on both sides. The Centauri Council has expressed concern about your friendship with technician Caldra, diplomat Laurel Winters told Nathan during a mission briefing. They've suggested it might be interpreted as Earth showing preference for genetic aberrations over standard Centauri. That's ridiculous, Nathan replied, his normally diplomatic tone edged with frustration. My personal relationships aren't official Earth policy. Perhaps not, but perception matters in diplomacy, as you well know. Winter's expression was sympathetic but firm. Several trade agreements remain unresolved. We can't afford complications. From the Centauri side, the pressure was more direct. Caldra was summoned to the office of Chief Administrator Vellner, where she found not only the administrator but also a Centauri genetic counselor waiting. Your interaction with the human diplomat has been noted with concern, Vellner began without preamble. While we acknowledge your unique circumstances have made normal Centauri relations difficult for you, seeking companionship outside our species is not an acceptable solution. My personal life is not relevant to my work performance, Caldra replied, standing straighter than she would have dared only months ago. On the contrary, the genetic counselor interjected. We have been reviewing your case, and there are new treatments that might reduce your physical abnormalities. With proper genetic therapy, you could potentially be reduced to a more acceptable height range within a year. Caldra stared in disbelief. You want to shrink me? We want to help you integrate properly with Centauri society, Vellner corrected. The human delegation will depart soon. This infatuation is temporary, but your life here is permanent. The word struck Caldra like a physical blow. Permanent. Was that true? Had she never considered alternatives because she believed there were none? That night, when she told Nathan about the meeting, his reaction was immediate and fierce. They have no right to try to change you, he said, pacing the length of her quarters. No right at all. They believe they're offering help, Caldra replied, though without conviction. Nathan stopped pacing, taking her larger hands in his. Come with me, he said suddenly. Back to Earth. When the delegation leaves. The suggestion was so unexpected that Caldra could only stare. I'm serious, Nathan continued. Earth has numerous alien residents already. The diplomatic corps would value your knowledge of Centauri technology and culture. And more importantly. His grip on her hands tightened. I don't want to leave you behind. Would I be accepted there? Caldra asked, the question emerging from her deepest fears. Or would I simply be a different kind of oddity? You would be yourself, Nathan said simply. And that's all I've ever wanted you to be. As the delegation's departure date approached, Caldra found herself facing the most significant decision of her life, remain in the world that had never accepted her, or risk everything for a chance at belonging somewhere new, with someone who saw her not despite her differences, but because of them. The morning of the human delegation's scheduled departure dawned with Centauri Prime's twin suns creating ripples of golden light across the spaceport. Caldra stood in her quarters, surrounded by the few possessions she deemed worth taking, technical manuals, a small sculpture she'd carved herself, and the clothing Nathan had helped her select for Earth's different climate and customs. Her decision had not come easily, vacillating between terror and hope until the final hours. What tipped the balance was not Nathan's persuasion, though his passion was compelling. Rather, it was the realization that she had already changed too much to return to her former existence of shadows and shame. A soft chime announced a visitor. Expecting Nathan, Caldra was surprised when the door slid open to reveal Prill, the young maintenance worker. You're really leaving, Prill said, her large eyes taking in the packed bags. Caldra nodded. My departure authorization is still pending, but yes, that's my intention. Prill shifted uncomfortably. The council is meeting about your request right now. I heard. I heard they're considering denying it. A cold weight settled in Caldra's stomach. While she had filed all the proper documentation to join the Earth delegation as a cultural and technical liaison, she had harbored doubts about its approval. Zentari rarely emigrated, and her case was unprecedented. "Thank you for the information," Caldra said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "That's not all," Prill continued, lowering her voice. "Administrator Vellner has ordered security to prevent you from approaching the human vessel if your authorization is denied." She hesitated, then added, "I don't think that's right. After seeing you these past months, standing tall, speaking up, many of us younger Zentari have been, reconsidering things." Caldra stared at the younger woman, momentarily speechless. "I never intended to become a symbol." "Sometimes we don't choose what we represent to others," Prill replied with unexpected wisdom. She pressed a security badge into Caldra's hand. "This is my access card for the maintenance tunnels. They lead directly to Docking Bay 7. With a final nod, she slipped away. Within moments, Caldra's communication device chimed with an official notification: request for departure denied. The justification cited ongoing genetic treatment protocols and essential infrastructure knowledge retention requirements, bureaucratic language masking the simple truth that the Zentari authorities were unwilling to let their aberration represent them among the stars. Caldra had exactly 22 minutes before the human vessel was scheduled to depart. 22 minutes to decide whether to accept the Zentari Council's decision or to defy a lifetime of conditioning that told her to submit, to remain small despite her size. The maintenance tunnels were cramped even for average-sized Zentari, forcing Caldra to crawl in sections, her shoulders scraping against conduits and her knees collecting grime from floors rarely cleaned. Yet there was something fitting about this final journey through her world, one last reminder of how she had never truly fit. She emerged into a service alcove adjacent to Docking Bay 7 just as an announcement echoed through the facility: final boarding call for Earth vessel Horizon. All delegation personnel report immediately for departure procedures. Security officers were positioned at every formal entrance to the bay, but their attention was focused on the main accessways, not the small maintenance hatch through which Caldra now peered. The human vessel gleamed under the bay lights, its boarding ramp extended, with Nathan visible at its base, engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with Administrator Vellner. "The technician's request has been officially denied," Vellner was saying, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Zentari law is quite clear on the matter of essential personnel." "She's not property," Nathan replied, his diplomatic veneer cracking. "She has the right to self-determination." "Actually," came a voice from behind them, Caldra's voice, stronger and more assured than it had ever been, "I have the right to petition for asylum under the Interplanetary Sentient Rights Accord, which Zentari Prime ratified last year." All heads turned as Caldra stepped from the service alcove, standing at her full height, her packed bag slung over one shoulder. Section 4, Paragraph 3, she continued, moving forward steadily. "Any sentient being may seek refuge with another signatory species if they can demonstrate reasonable fear of persecution or forced medical procedures against their will." Nathan's face broke into a smile of both relief and pride, while Vellner's expression darkened dangerously. "Technician Caldra, you are in violation of Council directives," the administrator sputtered. "Security, detain her." The Zentari officers moved forward uncertainly, clearly uncomfortable with the prospect of physically restraining someone of Caldra's size, especially in front of the human delegation. But before they could reach her, the human delegation's security officer stepped forward. "Under Earth diplomatic protocols, anyone seeking asylum may approach our vessel without interference. Any attempt to prevent this constitutes a violation of the very accord you cited, Administrator." "This is outrageous," Vellner hissed, but his authority was visibly crumbling in the face of interplanetary law and the unwillingness of his own security forces to create a scene. Caldra reached Nathan, who took her hand openly. "You came," he said quietly. "I decided I wanted to stand tall somewhere I'd be seen," she replied. The journey to Earth took 3 standard weeks, during which Caldra alternated between exhilaration at her newfound freedom and moments of paralyzing doubt about the unknown world awaiting her. Nathan remained a constant presence, introducing her to the other humans aboard the vessel, all of whom treated her unique physiology with casual acceptance that still felt miraculous. "Will everyone on Earth be so, unbothered by me?" she asked Nathan as they stood in the observation deck, watching the stars streak by. "Not everyone," he admitted honestly. "Humans have our share of prejudices. But you won't be seen as a genetic mistake, just as someone different. And different isn't feared the way it is on Centauri Prime." The truth of his words became apparent the moment they disembarked at Earth's primary spaceport in New Tanzania. Caldra had braced herself for stares, for whispers, for the familiar sensation of being a spectacle. There were indeed looks, but they lacked the revulsion she had known all her life. Some humans seemed curious, others appreciative, many entirely indifferent. A group of tall human females in athletic uniforms actually nodded to her with something like recognition. "Basketball team," Nathan murmured, seeing her confusion. "They're probably wondering which planet recruited you." As they made their way through the terminal, a small human child, a girl no more than 7 years old by Nathan's estimation, broke away from her parents and ran up to Caldra. "Are you a space princess?" the child asked, looking up with unabashed wonder. Caldra froze, utterly unprepared for the question. On Centauri Prime, children had been among her cruelest tormentors. Slowly, she knelt down to the girl's level. "No," she said gently. "I'm just Caldra." The girl considered this seriously. "Well, I think you look like a princess anyway. When I grow up, I want to be tall like you." As the child's embarrassed parents led her away with apologetic smiles, Caldra remained kneeling, overwhelmed by the simple interaction. Nathan helped her to her feet, his eyes understanding the magnitude of the moment. "Welcome home, Caldra," he said softly. Looking out at the crowded spaceport, at the varied heights and shapes and colors of humanity moving in organized chaos, at the glimpses of other alien visitors walking freely among them, Caldra felt something settle within her. The persistent ache of not belonging, which had been her constant companion for 32 years, began to fade. Here, in this world where diversity was the norm rather than the exception, perhaps she could finally become who she was meant to be. Not an aberration, not a mistake, but simply Caldra, 8 feet tall and, for the first time in her life, standing exactly as she was meant to. "Home," she repeated, tasting the unfamiliar word. Then, her hand finding Nathan's, she squared her shoulders and stepped forward into her new life, head high, back straight, no longer afraid to take up the space she deserved.